The original 28 Days Later did more than simply popularize the fast-moving zombie. It was a beautifully haunting exploration of social malaises in a time of increasing tensions surrounding war, politics, riots and pandemics such as the outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the UK in 2001. The film was never built around the premise of just surviving another typical zombie apocalypse. In fact, it was not even technically a zombie movie. Instead, it maintains this symbolic notion that the rage virus was a manifestation of the panic, chaos, and moral collapse brought on by a society succumbing to the pressures of a divided population. The thing was, behind its vicious, violent abruptness, relentless feeling of dread, and its reflexive state of misery over all that was lost, was an incredibly hopeful film. One where we follow in the shadow of Jim, our melancholic everyman, as he transcended the typical hero survivalist tropes that later became butchered by the genre's gradual dilution to repetitive bearded man cliches, and uses the empty, dreamlike void of loneliness to reflect on his lack of purpose in his pre-apocalyptic life, eventually discovering that purpose in the comfort of his new family. I could literally write a book on 28 Days Later. That's how much I consider it one of, if not the greatest pieces of horror cinema of the 21st century. So I'll fight anyone who doesn't like it or calls it just another zombie movie. If anything, it was an existential thriller that to this very day is relatable to real world anxieties. And I realize now, when I made a video on the first film around 4 years ago, god that makes me feel old, I never actually talked about its sequel, which, if history serves me correctly, means it should be god-awful. But it's not. It's really, really not. So let's talk about it. While 28 Weeks Later will always live in the shadow of the first film's profound allegorical brilliance, as far as sequels are concerned, 28 Weeks plays it just safe enough that it doesn't cower to the standards set by the original, nor does it do anything too risky to fuck with what came before it. It was a sequel that, on paper, had all the precursors of studio manufacturing to make it destined for failure. It lacked the holy grail creative duo of director Danny Boyle and writer Alex Garland. There were now 4 credited screenwriters, including Jesus apparently. It was directed by an unknown filmmaker whose career didn't exactly have much going on. It had the fearful logic of double the budget, double the scale, add in some Americans and double the profit, and technically most worrying of all, it's a sequel that was 5 years too late, as if the IP was dusted off the shelves without much sincerity. I think that's why we never got that rumoured 28 months later. Danny Boyle was clearly very interested in returning to direct, and 28 Weeks does end with a provocative image of the infection spreading globally, but trying to capture the same horrifying magic again during the rise of mid-2000s zombie movies where the market had become highly competitive and oversaturated? Yeah, it was too little too late to make a proper lasting impact. As a general summary, as the infected begin to die of starvation weeks following the initial outbreak, as shown in the conclusion of the first film, NATO takes control of the situation by sending in the US military to help restabilize the UK, destroy any viral remains, examine the virus itself, and, in its most arse-tightening what the fuck are you doing setup, decide to gradually repopulate the city of London in what can only be described as a hotbox ticking time bomb. However, the flawed nature of its setup isn't just some big dumb contrived logic hole to get us to the inevitable outbreak that you would expect from a sequel like this. Instead of just cheaply pandering to the zombie crowd, it actually devotes a hefty chunk of its runtime to confidently selling you on the underlying tensions of the military's growingly problematic rehabilitation efforts, unbeknownst to the innocent civilians just trying to rebuild their lives again. It uses Hitchcock's bomb under the table logic, where, from our perspective and that of the military's lead scientist Scarlett, we become gradually aware of the flaws in the military's containment procedures that inadvertently conflict with the safety of the public and that of the scientists, who understandably would like to figure out what the hell the virus actually is before they start overpopulating a volatile area where, you know from previous experience, bad shit is known to hit the fan pretty promptly. As such, you kinda come to understand what the film is trying to carry thematically from the first film. The outbreak isn't just characterized by this one douchebag bypassing security clearance and accidentally unleashing the virus again. A large part of it is built around a similar real-world government complacency, in that themes of national security and overpopulation are one thing, but ultimately the true downfall is how they reject any sort of moral responsibility for their actions. Sure, they are trying to do what they can to rebuild Britain, but there's this underlying disregard from the commander, where despite his efforts to simply eradicate the virus completely, he can just so easily shrug his shoulders and resort to the final solution of, oh fuck it, let's just bomb the city and pretend this never happened. I have full authority to do so, and it ain't my problem that we literally bottled civilians together into a viral Thunderdome death trap. While it is a very elaborate way of playing the whole revert the situation back to chaos card similar to other sequels of this nature, it's very much a more nihilistic version of the first film's political and social commentary on how the crisis of violent unrest and disease becomes so overwhelming and difficult to control that the government are pushed to such extreme measures to contain both issues. We have systems to maintain order and structure that allow society to function smoothly, but we cannot ignore that human nature, being as fallible as it is, means that stability is never truly a guarantee. It's even compounded by the fact that they fly all these innocent people back into the city from the safety and sanctuary of whatever country they were originally in, making the whole second outbreak both preventable and just a little bit more awkward. I suppose that is the main difference between both films. While the original is about finding hope amongst the misery, 28 Weeks Later is kind of the reverse, where it starts bleak, shows us hope, proceeds to get bleaker, and then just sorta stays bleak? In this respect, you could say it's somewhat backpedaling on the original film's outcome, but I appreciate its commitment to realism. I actually think it's the grounder film of the two because it removes Boyle's subjective poeticness, I guess you could call it, in favour of a more serious, bare-bones experience. But again, I do not think it necessarily hurts the first film, it just plays it more to the point, and while it definitely lacks the depth and nuance of Jim's journey, its character drama overall is still pretty decent. The film truly hits the ground running with an opening scene depicting the survival of another group during the initial outbreak who, in contrast to Jim and his group, are on fiercely tense terms, eventually leading to their own downfall. While I totally get why people hate the shaky camera work and Chris Gill's erratic editing style, for me, continuing the use of the DV camcorder graininess and the way motion and energy is conveyed in Gill's cuts has a powerfully relentless quality that contrasts with the slower, quieter moments before and after each attack. It's meant to feel sudden and off guard. Time and logic go right out the window because of how instantaneous the infection spreads. And then on a pure visual level, seeing Robert Carlyle's character Dawn race for the boat as the infected appear over the field like a stampede is the dog's bollocks of heart-racing anxiety. I mean, even I ran out of stamina just watching this scene. I think it might be the film's best moment overall, but that's not to discredit some of the other great moments, from the snipers trying to take out the infected amongst the civilians, to its modest attempts to play the introspective empty city card again, to that harrowing flamethrower scene that I'll come back to very soon. What helps give the story more emotional weight is how Dawn somewhat becomes the villain to the film. In the marketing, I recall him being treated as the hero, although it is Robert Carlyle, so it could go either way, to be honest. But in this case, he is the morally contentious part of the story. Interestingly, he was originally meant to play Christopher Eccleston's villainous character in the first film, but turned it down, and so this film actually uses him to quite a unique effect. Basically, Don abandons his wife during the attack at the farmhouse and embellishes this story to his kids that he couldn't do anything and that he tried to go back and so on. And in some oofed-style karma, the military discover that his wife actually survived, because while she is infected, her genetics prevent transformation. Hence, one of her kids might have the same genetics to engineer a vaccine, and that's when the plot becomes about getting them safely to an evacuation zone. So Don, not knowing this and overcome with survival, survivor's guilt, uses his security clearance to snog the lips off his wife, and she passes off saliva, and thus he becomes the main carrier of this new outbreak. I guess I sort of see it as his past not only catching up with him, but his actions having dire consequences on everyone else around him, in a sort of dual motif similar to how the military's decision to bomb the city comes at the expense of innocent survivors as well. You could even say it is actual karma for not staying with his wife and how much that eventually costs everyone, both figuratively and literally. However, I have a major issue with this idea because I personally do not always buy cowardice being used as a villainous trope. Okay, so put it this way, sure, he is selfish, I will give you that, and he does effectively lie to his kids so he doesn't look as bad in the narrative, I'll give you that as well, but I understand his reasoning. Like, the situation forced his hand and he reacted on natural human instincts. What the hell was he going to do that wouldn't also get him killed in the process as well? I think he does what most of us would probably do in this situation. He's terrified, disorientated, and his survival instincts have taken over. Don't act like you would be all Mr. Noblest Knight and sacrifice yourself if you were in his shoes just because you don't feel the same immediate pressure behind your comfy screen. It's like when I said in Dawn of the Dead that girl putting everyone at risk to save a dog she only knew for a couple of days was completely irrational, and everyone jumped at me as if I had killed the fucking dog. Like, I love dogs as much as the next person, and I am sure there are the feverish few that probably would throw everyone under the bus so that they would save the dog, and I get the context of her logic, but until you're in a situation where your life is in danger, it's totally human to act in what we call a selfish manner. It's because we're so wrapped up in morality, but morality does not come into the equation here. We're still animals, we still function on survival instincts no matter what we do. Also, just on that girl knew fine rightly that dog would be fine because the zombies had no interest in animals. You can tell I still get a lot of hate for it, and I am very salty about it. Anyway, getting to the end of the story, this is one of the few Jeremy Renner performances where he doesn't come off as a bit of a bravado douchebag. Great actor, don't get me wrong, but here he's especially likeable because he becomes the actual moral heart of the film. This was pre-Fame Renner, so he isn't amplified to any degree, but he does get the leader status boost in the second half of the film when he tries to save a handful of survivors after having a moral breakdown and abandoning his post following the commander's orders to execute every civilian because they can't contain the infection. He's like the antithesis to what the soldiers in the original film are. While those soldiers become morally depraved after seeing all the chaos and tragedy as simply just another example of people killing people, Renner's character Doyle sees it as the opposite and becomes a fatherly figure similar to Brendan Gleeson's character, who, like him, unfortunately meets a truly devastating fate. I mean, to this day, the scene of Doyle trying to move the car so Scarlett and the kids can get to the evac zone and then being set ablaze by those scorched earth motherfuckers is one of the most painfully grim ways I've seen such a lovable character get killed in a movie. I can't watch this scene. I can't. Let's just move on. I mean, Scarlett does not exactly get a pretty death either when Dawn suddenly comes along and batters her face in with Doyle's gun in what is an admittedly very underwhelming night vision scene. Dawn then gets shot, the son holds the cure, and the two kids escape, or so we think they do if the empty helicopter is anything to imply, because obviously it sets itself up for a sequel, which I still want. I guess to conclude, while a side-by-side comparison of both films puts the original in a significantly better light, I don't think you can outright dismiss 28 Weeks Later as a redundant sequel. Meaningless, maybe, but totally harmless. In fact, as far as what happened next style stories are concerned, it does a genuinely compelling job at showing us how things got better, while maintaining elements of its allegorical origins. It might not be profound, but in terms of visceral execution, I'd say it's actually a much more depressing watch when the ending leaves us in that void of despair that the original took us out of. That's why I want that sequel, not just because I want to see more or find out what happened next. Like the conclusion of my video on the original, all I care about is finding out that everything will eventually be okay.